This guy. Hey guys, I'm Jen Hargraves and I am an artist and a small business owner, and I make electroform jewelry. And today I am dishing out all of my tips on how I create electroformed jewelry. So if you're interested in electroforming, check out this video. Part one of this series, in my very first YouTube video, I showed you guys how I make my gold-filled bands for my electroform jewelry. And so what we need to do now is we need to sand down the epoxy that I have around the gemstones. And so you want to make sure that you make the epoxy clay look organic and natural and like it's part of the stone, because when the copper grows over the epoxy clay, it's going to resemble exactly what that clay looks like. And so a lot of times electroformers won't sand it down and it's really ugly afterwards, after they're done electroforming, because the electroform jewelry will take on the shape of the object that it's growing on top of. So you want to sand it down, make sure it's not pouring over the ring band, make sure that there's as little possible of the epoxy clay, and then you want to make it look kind of cool, make it look kind of natural, make it look kind of organic, just like the stone, and make it look like part of the stone. Another big thing when you're sanding down the epoxy is wear safety equipment. It's a big deal. There's a lot of this dust that gets in the air and you don't want that in your lungs. So just like when you're polishing, just make sure that you're wearing the proper equipment so that you're not inhaling any of that epoxy dust. Once you've sanded down your epoxy, then you want to use conductive paint around your stones. I always use 2 coats of paint because you're just going to miss spots. So you want copper paint to be your first coat of paint because it's reflective, it looks nice behind the stone, and it goes on pretty smoothly. So what I do is I use copper conductive paint first for my first coat of paint. Then I use silver conductive paint on top of the copper conductive paint. And so that way my pieces electroform very quickly. And silver is better because it is more conductive. So that means when you put your pieces into the electroforming solution, copper is going to grow faster on silver conductive paint than it would copper conductive paint or carbon conductive paint. When you're creating a bezel, when you're creating a bezel, through electroforming, the same principles of when you're metalsmithing apply. That bezel still needs to slightly cover your gemstone. So you either want to paint right up to the edge of the gemstone or just around the edges of the gemstone. A lot of electroformers won't securely attach their gemstones and they're going to fall out. It's not going to be secure. It's not going to hold. If you sell a piece like that, that gemstone is not going to last, especially when you're using raw asymmetrical stones. They tend to wiggle out of the bezel very easily. So you want to make sure you paint in a way that secures your gemstone. So paint all around that stone. And personally, I paint in between my stones most of the time. You'll see there's some emerald pieces here where I just paint on the edges, but most of the time I am painting in between my stones just to make sure that I never have to worry about a stone falling out on my rings. And once I'm done putting my 2 coats of conductive paint on, then I need to wait at least 12 hours for that conductive paint to dry. Before I add the sealant, I want to make sure that I take a copper wire and wrap it around the ring so that there's a conductive point between the ring and the wire. And then I'm going to put sealant over that ring band that has the copper wire on it. And that will allow electricity to flow through that wire and hit the ring band. And then we'll be able to electroform no problem. And I want to seal the actual ring bands themselves. I want to make sure no copper grows on the ring band or the stones. So at this point, I'm going to use sealant, usually a body latex, to stop copper from growing on the ring band or on the gemstones. So I'm going to put 2 coats of the body latex around the band only, and then I'm going to do 2 coats of the sealant, the latex, on the gemstones. 2 coats of latex or sealant on the gemstones stops that copper from overgrowing on my gemstones. And so that brings us to electroforming. And so I am not a chemist. I am an artist and a small business owner. So that is what I'm going to teach, is how to electroform as an artist. In the description, I will give an electroforming class I highly recommend. If you are looking for the details of how electroforming works for a very new beginner, check out this class. It is awesome. Totally recommend it. Before you start electroforming, you always want to make sure that you put on gloves. So the first thing I need to do is I need to clean my solution. After every bath, I put in my electroforming replenisher, which I get from Rio Grande, and that makes all the difference, guys, for having shiny pieces. After every batch of rings I do, I clean my solution, I put in my replenisher, a few drops, and then I add distilled water to bring the solution back to the original amount that the solution started at. I use a Rio Grande solution for my electroforming solution. I don't make my own electroforming solution. So I'll put my amps at 0.3 per ring, and that brings the voltage to about 2 or 4, which is right in the range you want to be. If your voltage is higher than at 4, then you want to recheck your connections and see if there's a problem. And I electroform for 15 hours, and that makes a really sturdy, thick bezel around my rings. So typically that means that I start at 6 a.m. and then take them out at 9 p.m. So electroforming day is a bit of a early morning, late-ish night, but it's totally worth it. Because if I do it during the day, then I can check on my rings that are electroforming and I can make sure that they're electroforming well and there's no problems, or I could address any problems that there may be and correct it, instead of having my rings electroform overnight and then I can't correct any problems that may happen, then I wake up and then I just have to start all over again. It is way better to electroform during the day when you could actually check on your rings or your whatever you're electroforming. So I personally do not use any stirrers or heaters when I am electroforming. I've tried it all. I've tried heating my solutions, I've tried the stirrers, none of it works. What I find just works really well is letting the solution be room temperature. And then basically halfway through electroforming, I will go in and I will move my bar, my cathode. I will move it so that it goes the opposite direction. The electricity is hitting the opposite rings than it was the first half of the batch. And so that way it kind of evens out how the copper grows on my jewelry, and it doesn't overgrow copper on one piece more than the other. And then after 15 hours and my pieces look good, I'm taking the rings out of the solution, and then I need to neutralize the acid that is still on those rings. And so I use a mixture of distilled water and baking soda, and I neutralize the solution so that I'm not hurt by the acid. And I take my rings out and wash them off, and we're done electroforming. Once you get your rings out of the solution, you want to cut off and remove that sealant that's around the gemstones and the ring bands itself. And so I just use a tiny pair of scissors to do this, and I'm very delicate because I don't want to scratch the ring band at all. Once I have the sealant off of the rings, then I want to smooth down the bezel itself. So once I have my bezels all smoothed out and the ring is smooth and comfortable and the size I want it to be, now I need to polish my ring, and I need to bring it to a mirror finish so that the plating that I'm going to put above it is shiny. And that's because the plating reflects the copper that's underneath it. So if you have a matte or dull copper, when you go to plate, you will have a matte and dull plating, which is, if you like that aesthetic, that's cool. But if you're like me and you're going for a really shiny, polished, professional finish, then you want to make sure you're polishing your entire ring to include the copper. Once my pieces are at that mirror finish, I'm going to move on to plating. And so for all of my pieces, I do a palladium plate. I do not use nickel plating in any of my jewelry. Also, I don't use any cyanide-based plating solutions. I only use acid-based plating solutions. So I try to be as safe as possible for both my health and also the health of my kitties who run around here and are super rambunctious. So what I do is I put all my plating solutions. I have silver, gold, rhodium, rose gold. I put them all into different bins. So that way I'm not mixing my solutions because that would be bad. You also don't want your electroforming solution to touch your plating solutions. That is bad. So you need to keep everything separate. So I put the solutions into different bins, and on the bins, on the lids, I write what the manufacturer's recommendation is for how to use the solution. So I write down the recommended voltage, I write down the type of anode I'm supposed to use, and then I do trial and error and I test my pieces. And as I find what works for me, what voltage works and what methods like does stirring work, does it not work, then I write down a gens method of what I have found that works so that I can make repeatable processes. Once my pieces all have palladium plating and I do all my pieces at once. I really like to do things in batches. I find it's the fastest way to do my work. So once all my pieces have their palladium plating on it, then I go and I do the gold plating. And it's the same thing. You want to electroclean for 30 seconds, then put it in distilled water, then acid clean it for 30 seconds, put it in distilled water, and then you put it into plating solution. So for gold plating, the thickest microns that you can get with the Legar solution that I use is 3 microns. And so I think industry standard for plating is 0.5 microns. And if I mispronounce things, it's only because I read and I don't necessarily hear how the words are pronounced. So if I'm not pronouncing words right, I'm sorry. It's just how I think words are pronounced. Also, words are hard to say for me for some reason. Anyways, there is an industry standard on what's considered plating and what is considered heavy plating. And I'd have to look it up to see what is considered heavy plating. I think it's 1 micron and higher. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that 3 microns is most definitely considered heavy plating. So you can say this is heavily plated if you make it 3 microns. So to do that, I do the longest possible time that I could plate the solution based on the manufacturer's recommendation, which is 36 minutes. And basically, any chemist you talk to will say that's way too long to plate your gold and unnecessary, but that's what I do to ensure that I have the thickest plating possible, because the downside to plating at home is you don't actually know, right? Like what the thickness level is of your plating, unless you have the right equipment to check the plating. So the only way to actually check the thickness level of your plating is if you have an XRF X-ray machine. And I don't know about you, but I don't want an X-ray machine in my house. Okay, so once we have the rings all plated and they look done, they're not done. Okay, so at this point we need to tumble the rings to clean off the little bit of solution still on there. And then I use nail polish remover to remove any of that conductive paint that still might be on the stones. And so we want to make sure the stones are all nice and clean. And then we need to let it dry. And it needs to be bone dry before we go to the next step. And the next step is that we are going to seal our bezels. And that's it, guys. So then we're all done. I let the rings dry for 2 hours with the sealant, and they're ready to go after that. I definitely put them in front of a fan because there's resin in it. You don't want that just kind of sitting in your room. You want them to dry as quick as possible. So I put the rings in front of a fan, let them dry out for 2 hours, and we are done. I'm so excited about this collection. This New Mexico inspired gold chili collection is awesome. It looks really cool. And of course, you know it, I'm going to do a giveaway of one of the rings in the gold chili collection. Thanks for watching this video, guys, and I hope you find something that makes your soul happy today.